And hello, people of the world. Welcome to the coolest corner of the universe. You're cool, I'm cool, we're all super cool. So today we are going to try and answer the question of caps and cups, or cups and caps, or was it a cup of tea? Okay, I'm being silly now. So USB medicine travel coolers, more recent product lines have started including caps, and these caps are positioned at the end of the aluminium tube. Actually, also more recently, the X6 or the Pioneer probe doesn't just have a cap, but it actually has an entire cup that comes inside the flask that sits over the aluminium tube. So a lot of subscribers have been asking the question, is the cap important for temperature control? What does it mean? What does it mean if the cap is on or it's off, or if it moves or it doesn't? What if I don't have quite enough space and need to squeeze in another pen or an auto injector or an extra vial or something like that? These are all really great questions. So I figured I would design a couple of experiments to investigate this question of whether the caps really have a material impact on the temperature performance of the medicine coolers. So I've got a lot of cool data to show you today that I've collected over a couple of days. So I hope you find this interesting, and also I hope that it really brings you a great, say, peace of mind as it relates to how you think your cooler may or may not perform when you're traveling and stuff. So let's jump on in and let me show you what I got. So there's a lot of data in this presentation, I can tell you that. So just a quick disclaimer, all the data that I've generated is my own. I am using calibrated temperature probes, so it's highly unlikely that this data is erroneous. My views are my own. I'm on a personal quest to find the best medicine travel coolers that are out there, and I am sharing my journey with you as I explore all of these interesting products. So let's jump on in. Today we are focused on the X6, also known as the Pioneer Pro from Secret's Box, rebranded for 4 All Family. There's also the 4 All Family Voyager XL, the 4 All Family RxCooler Max that's more recently been branded as simply Pioneer. I've also seen it called the Max in different places, and then finally we're also taking a look at the RxCoolers Mini, also known as the Mini Pro in its unbranded form. The names kind of jump around, but the pictures speak 1,000 words anyway, so I think you can tell which devices are which from the pictures. So here we are. So this is kind of the stars of the show. We have the X6 white, the X6 black, the Voyager XL, which has the larger aluminium tube, or the wider one. We've got the RxCoolers Max with that distinctive handle. By the way, I couldn't help it. I bought the magenta colored one, which was kind of cool. And then we've got the RxCoolers Mini. This picture also starts to give you an idea of experimental setup. So the way I approach the temperature measurements was that each unit has an auto-injector dummy pen. Each unit will have a calibrated switch block probe. The temperature probe position, the measuring probe, the upper one is in the upper position and the lower probe is in the lower position. The lower position is deliberately put there because that's going to be right next to where the drug product sits in the pen. Also, we're using tempo discs at different points. The tempo discs will typically be used to measure the temperature at the very base of the unit if there is space. So you'll understand that more in a moment. Now, one little, let's call it deviation or snag, is the RxCoolers Mini does not have enough room to fit both the SwitchBot probes and a Zepbound auto-injector when the cap is on. The cap structure is just a little bit too big. So in this experiment, I removed the cap from a dummy Zepbound pen that I have, a trainer pen. But just sort of keep that in mind, that I had to do that deliberately because there just wasn't quite enough space in the aluminium tube to fit a full cap. So I'll keep on going here because the experimental setup was quite complex, and so I'll sort of try my best to walk you through what I did, and hopefully it's clear. So now maybe just zoning in more closely just so you can really get to see the measuring setup. So here are the two SwitchBots. Now these temperature probes, the little ports, actually in the live experimental position, they would be pointing directly at the pen, so they're directly measuring the temperature of the pen. So just sort of keep that in mind. And then they're attached to the auto injector, so that they don't sort of slip or move position. So these temperature probes will always stay with wherever the auto injector is. And then this just gives you a little bit more of a closer view of the tempo discs. The tempo discs have sort of a grid on one of the sides, and so I always made sure that the grid points upwards to measure the temperature that's just above it rather than just below it, because I'm interested in that position, if that sort of makes sense. So hopefully this gives you kind of a really close up on the temperature measuring. Alright, so now diving a little bit more deeper to walk you through the experimental setup to answer this question of to cap or not to cap. That is the question. I guess I'm being silly again. So the way this experiment plays out is it essentially flows in 5 rounds. And when I walk you through each of the rounds, it will, I think, become obvious as to why I did it that way. The experiment is one continuous run, so the temperature probes are just logging the data continuously from beginning to end. So you'll sort of see that play out in the graph. So let me sort of walk you through this. So in round 1, each of the rounds was several hours to a day, so just sort of keep that in mind. So round 1 was basically, I have what I call the pen and the probes suspended. So suspended means I have them held in position inside the aluminium tube because I want to measure the temperature at an exact position, but the caps are not yet in position, so there's no cups or caps when I do this first round. I do use the SwitchBots, as I mentioned. They're attached to the dummy auto injector pen. And then at the base of the flask, I am using one of the tempo probes, or discs as they're called. And so this gives me kind of a really nice baseline of what is the temperature at the base, and then what is the temperature of the drug product and the pens at the position where they would normally sit if there were a cap, but there isn't. And then I'll show you in a minute how I did this suspended position. Not complicated. I was using elastic bands to do that, and I have some pictures. So then going from round 1 to round 2, the most noticeable thing here is that I then so I remove the elastic structure and then I put the caps or the cups in position. And then the drug product's basically just sitting there, resting against the sort of the base of the cap. But it shouldn't actually move because it was already kind of suspended in that position. Now the only nuance now is that there isn't enough room at the base to have a tempo disc. The space here, although it looks wide in this schematic, is actually very small, and there's not enough space for that. So I remove it and I position it just outside in front of the test bay, because I'm going to reuse them later on. So then we go to round 3. So in round 3, what I do is I then remove the cap, but because the auto-injected pen and the temp probes are no longer suspended, they're just sort of sitting there free form, resting on the cap or the cup, they can now fall to the base of the flask. So now the question is, when they fall all the way to the base of the flask, what is the temperature? So that's kind of interesting. We shall find out. So continuing then on with that, I then do a 4th round, but what I do here is, so there's still no cups or caps, but I now open it up and I place the tempo disc back in position, and then I measure this. The reason why I actually want to do this is because this is actually my normal way of traveling. I don't bother with these caps. Actually, the products that I have didn't even come with them originally. I'll explain that story in a minute. And so I actually really like having a Bluetooth temperature probe sitting at the base. The reason why is I know that this is always what is called the warmest spot in the flask, because it's the furthest away from the Peltier plate that sits by the USB cooler. But when I say warmest, you're talking like 1 or 2 degrees difference. But I like having the probe here because it really gives me that early read on whether something is a problem or not, because this would be the thing that warms up first. And then finally, for that 5th round, the last one, I go back, I open it up, and I then re-put the cap back on. But this time, I use the tempo disc. So the tempo disc is now sitting on the base of the cap, and then the pen is sort of essentially resting on top of that. Now, of course, you just have to imagine that for the X6, this is a cup that's actually sitting over here, not a cap at the end of the aluminium tube, but it's the same principle. You know, the pen is essentially sitting on the cap or the cup in those respective rounds. So hopefully that gives you kind of a taste of the experimental flow, and then it also now gives you a taste of hopefully this gives you quite a comprehensive view of what is the temperature situation under different setups with regards to this sort of cap or cup business. So let's keep on going. Okay, so as I promised, I was going to include some pictures as well. So here you can see the sort of the suspension structure that I created. I basically wrapped a plastic band around the aluminium tube, and then I created a little elastic structure to bridge the hole so that the pen would essentially rest on it. But this is great because it's if there's flow or thermal gradients or different things like that could be sensitive to this cap, this will give me a really good idea of whether the cap is important or not for temperature control. So one thing to also think about here is, let me digress a little bit and just mention why have these caps started appearing. So actually, if you'll notice the more recent models, they came with a very small little paper slip inside to say, hey, there is a piece of foam at the sitting at the base of the Peltier plate, the cooling plate. Don't remove that. It's to protect the glass vials from smashing. And then on top of that, they introduced this sort of cap thing. Basically, what it boils down to is there was a lot of people that started complaining that although the cooling is great, if I have a glass, these little small glass insulin vials, and there's I'm traveling, there's a little bit of shaking or different things like that, they're basically gonna smash if they move too much. And so that was the reason why some of the more recent products and models have started appearing with these caps. Now there's plastic rigid caps, there's plastic, let's call them actually rubber caps, and then there's actually, here you can see there's the full-on cups that sit over the aluminium tube. So there's lots of different iterations of this to sort of consider and keep in mind. These plastic caps, actually these screw in, so there's actually a receiving structure, a little screw receiving structure. This is the 4-all family Voyager XL, and this is the RxCoolers Max. So there's a little receiving structure where you can screw this thing in. Now the Voyager XL has it, but a lot of the Voyager models either don't have it or they have the rubber version. So anyway, so it seems a little bit hit or miss on which one you get. And then this is just to kind of give you a more closer look at that. So you can kind of see, the Zepbound pen has quite a nice base, which allows you to, but basically when this is upright, it will just sort of rest against this little suspension bridge. And then, as I mentioned, for the RxCoolers Mini, there wasn't enough room for a Zepbound pen base with the temperature probe, so I removed it, and here's sort of a picture so you can kind of see that. And then here you can also see those tempo discs, and note how thin and small they are, and when you put the cap on there actually isn't enough room, so the distance is very small between the aluminium tube and where the base, the foot of the flask is. And just to sort of give you a perspective on that, what I tried to do here was to take some pictures showing you what I think is the resting distance for the pens when they essentially slide down and sit at the base of the flask. And as you can see, it's not very much. They don't really move, so that space is not very, very sort of large. This was, I just tried to very gently open them up while they were on this. After they had been upright, I put them on their side so they were resting, and then I opened them up to hopefully reveal where the pen position was. Now for the RxCoolers Mini, actually the pen was wedged into position, so what I had to do here was to sort of shimmy it out, put it into the flask so that it would essentially move in relation to how much space it has, and then I took it back out, and then you can and that sort of reveals to you the distance of where it would actually be sitting. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a close-up of that. Let's keep on rolling. So yeah, so now for some data. So here's the big graph, and then we're gonna break this down into pieces over a couple of slides. So so bear with me. So as you can see, we've got the typical ambient temperature plots, which are kind of rolling here. I've got 3 different devices measuring the ambient temperature, so definitely have a good read on what that is. Now we can see the quadrants of round 1, round 2, round 3. Round 4 is a little bit smaller, and then round 5. And then within those rounds we can start to see what's happening with each of the respective coolers. So the RxCoolers Max, which was magenta, I figured I would make that plot magenta so you can sort of see that doing its thing. It was the one that was running the warmest, and I knew this because I've tested this unit before and so this temperature profile was kind of expected. So I'm glad it was doing exactly what I expected. I have one of the earlier models. I hear some of the more recent models have improved a little bit. I've not had the chance to test multiple. I've only had one, and I still have that unit. So just bear with, just keep in mind that this data set here is a reflection of the units that I have. For all family Voyager XL is the blue plot, so you can kind of see that rolling along here. And then a little bit overlapping with each other, we got the X6 and the X8. Those sort of are rolling together. I set those at 2 degrees centigrade. I figured I would go all in, and they are on power level 2, so plenty of room for going up or down. And then the RxCoolers Mini, I selected the best one that I have in my inventory. It's infamous RxCooler number 24. I've actually kept this one for myself, or perhaps a patient, a community patient will twist my arm and grab it from me. I don't know, but anyway. And yeah, that one runs at spot on 36 Fahrenheit most of the time, so it's a super nice unit. And it outperforms the X6, both of the X6s by just a smidget. So yeah, this is a prized possession for sure. But now you can start to get a feel for the how the caps play into this. And if you notice, at a macro level, really not that much at all. So we've got, here we've got temp profiles with no caps or cups. Then we shift to with caps and cups. Then we go back to no caps and cups. We let the pen fall to the bottom, and then we go. We add back the temp probe, and then we add back the caps and the cups. So at a macro level, it's really pretty steady throughout the entire experiment. There are a couple of, let's call them little bumps, thermal bumps. You can see one here, you can see one here a little bit, but actually, make note of the ambient temperature. So when this might have been a window opening or closing or a fan going on, and just have a look at that ambient temperature kind of going up and down, and then at some points going really quite low. And note how some of the bumps kind of coincide with just reacting to that thermal change. So I think overall these cooling units were, I'm going to say, more sensitive to the ambient temperature cycles than they really were to whether there was a cap or a cup attached to them. Let's keep on going so you can see now the data on a more individual level for each of the different products. Okay, so I removed the ambient stuff, so now you can sort of see the different experimental setups. Sometimes a visual is a little bit nicer, so you can kind of see the without cap but in position, with the cap in position, letting it drop to the base, adding the tempo disc back, and then adding the cap back with the tempo disc. So now you can kind of see the different profiles there. And feel free to pause this presentation at any point in time so that you can study the data carefully. If you want these slides or the raw data, you're welcome to email me. All of this is fair game. You can have fun with it. Actually, I was kind of tempted to try and see what Claude might do with this. I think this could be quite a good case study. Claude the AI, that is. So let's keep on rolling. So now, if you can see, I am just zoning in on the data for the X6 Pioneer Pro secret box for all family white and black model. So here you can see the two models, and then here you can see the data plot. So overall really quite nice. The only thing that I did notice was that the the temp probe sitting all the way at the base did measure a little bit higher than the temp probe that was, you know, sitting or seating more towards where the drug product was, or a little bit higher up in position. There was maybe a 3 or 4 degree Fahrenheit gradient, but then a little bit later on, you still detect that gradient. But it's you still detect that gradient, so it's right here, but it's not too bad, you know, but it's interesting. So I think of all the different units, this was the one that perhaps had the slightly widest temperature gradient between the base of at the base of the product, but as you can see, still very, very nice. There was a little bit of a difference between the white model and the black model. The black plots for the black model, the green plots for the white one. There was about a 1 or 2 degree difference between the two units, which is quite interesting to see. But that, you know, essentially you can write off as manufacturing variability, and I've said a lot about that already. So this is just sort of bringing the ambient temperature data back, so you can kind of see that plot again. And actually, when you think about it, this one was quite stable, even at quite a range of different ambient temperature conditions. So if you look at this plot, it was going from 75 all the way down to 60, but just look at how stable this temperature profile is. Very nice. And most importantly, cups. So the X8 has cups, and as you can see, the cup really doesn't make any difference whatsoever to the temperature profile. Bringing in some lines there just so you can really kind of zoom in and see how steady that plot is. So then next we have the 4-all family Voyager XL. So here you can basically see the data plot for that. So it's a much tighter data plot in relation to the gradient from the base of the unit to sort of higher up positions. But again, it's a very nice plot. It's hovering around the 40 Fahrenheit mark. If I now bring in the room temperature plot, you can kind of see that really most of these little blips here are the result of swaying ambient temperature more than anything else. And then if I bring in the line marker here, so you can kind of see how straight or not that is. You know, this was a really nice temperature profile. It was hovering in the sort of the 38, 39 to 40, 41 kind of mark. So this is the 4-all family Voyager XL. So really, you know, the cap. So the Voyager XL has a cap. Didn't really seem to have any material effect on whether the temperature was going to be cooler or not at that position at the base of the unit. So I'll keep on rolling. So now we got the 4-all family Voyager, the RxCoolers Max. So the Max, unfortunately, the model I have was a poorer performing model. I've done a video on this, but here's the data profile. Actually, when you look at it from when you sort of do head-to-head with ambient temperature, you know, most of the blips are the result of just ambient temperature pressure or stress, I should say, rather than that. So strain and stress of the ambient temperature cycles. And then really very, very stable thermal temperature profile, regardless of whether you have a cap or not. It's a very, very nice data package here as well. And then finally, the RxCoolers Mini. So the RxCoolers Mini was hovering down at the 36, even maybe 35.5 mark. So this was outright the best performing unit that I have from a temperature perspective. And then really, again, you know, cap versus no cap, sitting at the base or not, very, very negligible impact across the board. Just noticing those temperature gradients depending on where you are position-wise. Very subtle. And then here I'll put the ambient temperature back, so you can see most of these blips and bumps are the result of the sway in an ambient temperature. And then now, interestingly enough, this was a little bit wider. So I remember data on the RxCoolers Mini. It was, let's call it, a little bit more sensitive to some of the sways in ambient temperature, and so you can kind of see that here as it kind of blips up and down. Kind of hovered from 35 to 40. So this was, you know, a little bit wider than the others performance-wise. But just sort of to give you a little bit of an engineering perspective on this question of cups and caps. You know, if you know anything about processors, you know, so chips, computer processors, they have a heat sink, they have a fan. You know, the heat sink is basically pulling the heat from the processor into the grids, and then the fan is blowing that heat away. And so it's it's sort of a constant process. So in the case of USB coolers, what you have, and this is sort of for illustration purposes, you have this grid, this radiator or the heat sink, which is actually the aluminium tube. So this aluminium tube is a heat sink that's pulling the energy, the temperature, the thermal energy from the flask up to the Peltier plate that's sitting right at the base of the USB lid. You can see the Peltier plate when you look up through the aluminium tube, and then on the other side there's essentially a fan that's blowing or pushing away that heat. And then of course you can kind of go online and you can kind of see how that looks from a sort of an electrical thermal energy kind of schematic. So when you now take that one step further and you think about how this plays out with an actual USB medicine cooler, you can now start to understand and imagine that the aluminium tube isn't an enclosed container within the structure that is somehow keeping the cold, or it's kind of a smaller container that's holding the cold better or whatever. This entire structure is a heat sink that's aluminium, so it's highly conductive, and it's pulling that thermal energy both on the inside wall and the outside wall. If the outside wall was for whatever reason warmer, that conductivity would very quickly pull that heat inwards. And so this heat sink is working on both sides, not just the inside, but on the outside and the inside, and really just pulling all that thermal energy that's sitting inside the flask which surrounds it. So having a cap at the base, and also think about the fact that there are no fans inside these thermo flasks. It's all thermal convection. There's no fans that are blowing or pushing or anything like that. So there should be no real reason why having a cap just positioned here, or even midway, or even here, or actually note they've now started to put that little foam disc right over here, should have a material effect on the core temperature of your unit. It's really all about, you have a fan in the USB lid, you have a Peltier plate that's pulling, it's basically you've got a cold and a hot surface and it's pulling the cold, and then you've got this heat sink, this large aluminium structure that sits in there that's essentially pulling the heat like a computer chip or processor. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more of an engineering sort of feel for why it's this sort of having a little cap or whatever here or not really is irrelevant or immaterial or negligible. So I tried to wrap this up with a table. So here are the contenders for today. Here are their names, and I'm going to say caps and cups are basically negligible. They really don't have any material effect on the temperature performance. Now that said, the one thing I didn't know is temperature gradients are a little bit more interesting. So the X6 does have a slightly higher temperature gradient when you go all the way down to the base of the flask. So I made a little bit of note about that. It's in the 3 to 4 Fahrenheit range. So I would probably be careful with my planning and trips in regards to this zone here. But just note that actually at that position, you were still operating at very low temperatures anyway, because the X6 is you can set the temperature and stuff like that. The Voyager XL was pretty good. You know, there was maybe a +2 or 3 Fahrenheit gradient when you got all the way to the bottom. And then the RxCoolers Mini and Max, they seem to have the lowest temperature gradient. But just to put this into perspective, these are very, very small sort of temperature shifts, if that's the right way to say that. So really nothing to worry about in regards to your cooler performance. So there you go. I really hope you found this video presentation interesting. This took me a good 4 or 5 days to compile. If you have more experimental ideas or other things you would like me to look at, send me a message about that. And then there was a lot of data to go through here. I really tried to give it the quick version. Please take a moment to look at all the graphs, to take to do your own analyses and stuff. And I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you think. So as you know, I am trying to rally around the Discord community so we can have interactive conversations or chat messages. So if this presentation catches your attention and you fancy chatting with me beyond just email, please come by the Discord server and send me a message. But if you like email, that's okay too. I am fair game. So that's a wrap for today. I wish you a really, really good week, and I will talk to you again. Have a good one.